The air inside the high-end piano showroom felt different from the city outside. It was thick with the scent of lemon wax and old, seasoned wood, a smell that spoke of money and tradition. Sunlight, bright and golden, poured through the massive front windows, making the dust motes dance like tiny, sparkling fairies in the air. Row upon row of pianos stood like silent, elegant beasts. Some were black and gleaming, others were a deep, warm brown, and a few in the corner were a pristine, snowy white. Their lids were propped open just so, revealing the complicated webs of strings and hammers inside. Each one a promise of the music it could make. In the center of this grand space, right under the main chandelier, was the star of the showroom, a 9-foot concert grand piano that looked as if it had been carved from a single piece of midnight. This was where the small master class was taking place. The senior instructor, a man with a back as straight as a metronome's pendulum and silver hair combed meticulously across his scalp, was observing his student. He was a man who believed music was not just heard, but felt with a kind of religious reverence. His entire life was built around the rules and soul of classical music, and he saw himself as a gatekeeper to that world. His student, a young boy of about 14, sat on the bench, his shoulders tense. The boy's fingers, which were slender and quick, hovered over the ivory keys. He had just finished playing a series of scales, and the silence that followed felt heavy and judgmental. "No, no," the old instructor said, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a knife. He didn't raise it, but its sharpness was enough to make the boy flinch. "You are striking the key. You must caress it. The note is not a command. It is a request. You are begging the sound to come out, not forcing it. Do you understand?" The boy nodded quickly, his eyes fixed on the keys, not daring to look up. Leaning against a nearby smaller piano was the shop's younger instructor, a woman with a stylish dress and too much shiny jewelry. She was the instructor's protege, or at least that's what she told people. She believed in the flair of performance, the drama of it all. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail against her teeth. "He has the speed, teacher," she said, her voice a smooth, melodic purr. "But the passion? It is like reading a recipe without tasting the food. It is all technical, no heart." The old man nodded, pleased with this analysis. It matched his own thoughts exactly. Precisely. Precision without emotion is just noise. And we are not in the business of making noise. We are in the business of creating art. He spoke the word art as if it were a sacred prayer. Just then, the soft chime of the doorbell announced a new arrival. An older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, stepped inside. She was a stark contrast to the gleaming world around her. She wore a simple, dark-colored coat that had seen better days and comfortable, flat-looking shoes. Her hair was short and practical, and her face was lined with gentle wrinkles, especially around her eyes, which were a calm and observant shade of blue. She carried a worn leather bag that looked heavy and full of tools. She didn't look at the people or the expensive decor. Her eyes scanned the room. But she was looking at the pianos themselves, her gaze appraising. Almost like a doctor looking at patients, she gave a small, polite nod to the group in the center and walked quietly towards a piano that was tucked away in a corner, a bit away from the main performance area. This was the one she was here to work on. The old instructor's eyes followed her, a clear look of annoyance on his face. Her quiet presence, the soft thud of her tool bag on the floor, was an interruption. It was an unwelcome dose of reality in his carefully constructed world of high art. He turned his attention back to his student, raising his voice just enough to make sure the new arrival could hear. "It is a true tragedy in our modern world," he began, speaking more to the younger instructor and the few wealthy parents watching than to the boy. "The separation between the artist and the artisan. There are those who are born to understand the poetry, the very soul of the music." He gestured dramatically to the piano in front of him. "And then there are others, the mechanics. They see the instrument as a machine, a collection of wires and hammers to be tightened and adjusted. They can appreciate the craftsmanship, perhaps, but they can never hear the music that lives within." The younger instructor laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was anything but kind. "Oh, how true," she said, pushing herself off the piano she was leaning on. She glided across the polished floor towards the older woman, who had already opened her tool bag and was taking out small, strange-looking metal implements. The woman's focus was entirely on the piano, her hands moving with a quiet, practiced purpose. The stylish instructor stopped beside her and looked down, her expression a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "I do hope you know what you're doing." "Dear," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that was purely fake. "It would be a shame if you were to, if you were to fix a masterpiece into mediocrity." She paused, then leaned in a little closer. "You do know what a C-sharp minor chord is, don't you? It would be awful if you thought you were just fixing a broken string and accidentally ruined the instrument's voice." The older woman finally looked up from her work. Her eyes were not angry or offended. They were just calm. She looked at the stylish instructor for a long moment, then her gaze flickered over to the senior teacher and the nervous boy. She seemed to take in the entire scene in a single, quiet glance. "I have a fair understanding of them," she said, her voice soft but clear. It had a simple, honest quality to it, completely without pretense. Then she looked back down at the piano keys, gently pressing one, then another, listening intently to the quiet, muted sounds. Her simple answer seemed to annoy the stylish instructor even more. She had expected the woman to be flustered, or maybe to say she didn't know, which would have been a delightful piece of gossip. Instead, the calm, confident reply was a wall she couldn't break through. She gave a little huff and walked back to the center of the room. The senior instructor watched the exchange with a grim smile. He saw the woman's lack of deference not as confidence, but as a lack of respect for her betters. He turned back to his student, his voice now colder, more determined. "You see, boy, that is the sound of apathy. The sound of a job. Our work is a calling. Now, from the top. And this time, make the music weep." The boy took a deep, shaky breath, placed his trembling fingers back on the keys, and began to play once more the quiet, methodical tapping of the technician's tools in the corner, a steady, unnoticed rhythm against the storm of his performance. The boy's fingers stumbled over the keys, a jarring sound that made the old instructor wince as if he'd been physically struck. The music, a complex piece by a long-dead composer, was supposed to flow like a river, but under the pressure it was coming out in choppy, nervous little bursts. The boy's face was flushed, and a small bead of sweat trickled down his temple. Every few seconds his eyes would dart towards the corner of the room, where the quiet, rhythmic tapping continued. It wasn't loud, but in the tense silence of the showroom, it was impossible to ignore. The old instructor held up a hand, his gesture sharp and final. The boy stopped playing instantly, his hands hovering in midair over the keys. "No," the old man said, his voice low and heavy with disappointment. "You have lost the melody. You are allowing yourself to be distracted." He didn't look at the boy when he said this. His cold, steady gaze was fixed on the woman in the corner. He turned his body slightly, addressing the small group of parents who were watching the master class with rapt attention. They were all dressed in fine clothes, their expressions a mixture of pity for the boy and admiration for the teacher's firm hand. "You see," the old instructor began, his voice taking on the tone of a professor giving a lecture. "True music requires a sacred space. It demands an environment where the soul can breathe. And what do we have here?" He gestured with a dismissive wave of his hand towards the corner. "We have a clatter, a disruption. We have the sound of work." He said the word work as if it were something dirty, something beneath him. The parents in the audience nodded solemnly, a few of them shooting disapproving glances at the woman. She, however, seemed completely unaware. She had a small felt strip placed over the strings, muting them, and was gently tapping each key with a specialized tool, listening with an intensity that shut out the entire world. Her focus was absolute. The younger instructor saw her opening. She glided forward, a predator sensing weakness. "It's like trying to write a poem in the middle of a factory floor, isn't it?" she said, her voice ringing with false sympathy. "All that banging and clanking. It's for a different kind of person, I suppose." She looked around the room, making eye contact with the parents, inviting them into her little circle of superiority. Some people are built to create the beauty, and others are built to maintain the tools. It takes all sorts, doesn't it? A few of the parents chuckled, a polite, hollow sound. The boy on the bench slumped his shoulders even lower, his shame now mixed with a growing sense of unease. He didn't like this. He just wanted to play his piano. The younger instructor, fueled by the small reaction, decided to push further. She walked over to the corner, her high heels clicking loudly on the polished wooden floor. She stood over the woman, peering down at the intricate inner workings of the piano as if it were a strange insect. What a lot of little bits and pieces, she said, her voice loud and purposely grating. It all looks so terribly complicated. It must be so easy to get lost in there and forget what the instrument is actually for. The woman finally stopped her work. She slowly lifted her head and looked up at the stylish instructor standing over her. Her blue eyes were clear and untroubled. She didn't say anything for a moment, she just looked. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. The younger instructor's smile began to waver, just a little. She had expected a stammered reply or an angry flush, but she got neither. "It has a purpose," the woman finally said, her voice quiet but firm. She gestured inside the piano. "Each piece has a job. If they all do their job correctly, the artist can do theirs." She then looked back down at her work, her hands already moving again, adjusting a tiny screw with a delicate wrench. The conversation from her perspective was over. This calm dismissal was more infuriating than any argument could have been. The younger instructor's face tightened for a split second before she forced a bright, brittle laugh. "Well, isn't that just the sweetest, most practical little thing to say?" she said, turning back to the room. "She sees it as a job, a list of tasks." "Oh, darling," she said, directing her words to the woman but speaking to the audience, "art is not a task. It is a calling. It is a miracle. You can't get to a miracle by tightening a screw." The old instructor nodded in approval, a grim smile on his lips. He was enjoying this now. He felt he was teaching a much more important lesson than just piano technique. He was teaching about hierarchy, about class, about the natural order of things. "She is correct about one thing," he said, his voice booming now, full of self-importance. "Each piece has a job. Her job is to be silent and invisible. She is a stagehand, not an actor. The play is not about her." He let that hang in the air, a final, cutting judgment. The humiliation was now complete. The woman was just a background character, a prop in their grand drama of artistic superiority. The boy felt his stomach twist into a knot. He wanted to say something, to tell them to stop, but the old instructor's glare was like a physical force, pinning him to his seat. He was trapped. The old instructor, satisfied that he had made his point, turned back to his student. "Now," he said, his voice brisk and commanding, "we will continue, and you will play with such passion and such volume that you will drown out all other distractions. You will remind this room what real music sounds like. Show them. Show her." He pointed a finger at the corner, not looking at the woman, but using her as a symbol of everything that was coarse and unartistic. The boy took a deep, shaky breath. He looked down at the keys, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt hostile now. The beautiful sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to mock him. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. He poured all his frustration and all his anxiety into the music, and the sound that came out was loud and aggressive, but it was no longer beautiful. It was just noise, a desperate, angry sound that filled the room and clashed horribly with the quiet. Methodical tapping of the technician's tools in the corner, a steady rhythm of quiet dignity against a storm of arrogant noise. The boy's fingers crashed down on the keys, and a torrent of sound filled the showroom. It was loud, just as the old instructor had demanded. The notes came fast and furious, a storm of sound that was meant to be passionate and powerful. But to anyone listening closely, it was hollow. It was the sound of fear, not feeling. The boy was attacking the piano, trying to conquer it, to prove something to the man who held his future in his hands. His face was a mask of concentration, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He wasn't thinking about the music's story or its emotion. He was thinking only about being loud enough, forceful enough to drown out the quiet, rhythmic tapping from the corner. That tapping continued, a steady, unwavering beat against the chaos of his playing. It was like a calm heartbeat in a room filled with screaming. The old instructor stood with his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He believed he was forging the boy in fire, forcing him to rise above the distractions of the common world. The younger instructor watched, her eyes gleaming. She saw this as a drama, a performance of her own making. Where the delicate artist battled against the crude reality of the workman, the boy played on. His fingers flying, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was reaching the climax of the piece, a section filled with thundering chords and rapid, cascading notes. It was the part where he was supposed to unleash all of his soul, all of his passion. He took a deep breath and threw his entire body into the next chord, striking the keys with all his might, and then it happened. It wasn't a soft sound. It was a violent, ugly twang, like a giant rubber band being snapped against a metal box. It ripped through the music, a raw, metallic scream that cut through everything. A horrible, buzzing vibration followed, a sickening hum that hung in the air like a ghost. The boy's hands flew off the keys as if they'd been burned. The music died. Silence. The silence that followed was heavier and more awful than any sound. It was a silence filled with shock and shame. The boy stared at his hands, then at the piano, his eyes wide with horror. He thought he had done it. He thought he had hit the keys so hard, so wrongly, that he had broken the priceless instrument. A hot flush of shame crept up his neck, burning his ears. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, and he wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. The old instructor's face had gone from smug satisfaction to pale, stark panic. The younger instructor's dramatic smile had vanished, replaced by a look of genuine disgust. "What was that?" she hissed, as if the boy had deliberately ruined her afternoon. The old instructor rushed to the piano, his movements stiff and unnatural. "What have you done?" he snapped at the boy, his voice sharp with accusation. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached down and dramatically lifted the heavy lid that covered the piano's inner workings, revealing the forest of strings and the complex mechanism of the hammer's dot, and there it was. One of the thickest strings, a heavy copper wound string that produced the deep, resonant bass notes, had snapped. It coiled back on itself like an angry snake, its broken end dangling dangerously. The buzzing sound was coming from it, vibrating against the other strings. The piano was wounded. It was crippled. The old instructor stared into the mess, his mouth slightly agape. He had spent his life talking about the soul of the piano, the voice of the piano, the heart of the piano. But looking at the tangled wires and the wooden parts, he saw only a machine he didn't understand. It was like a surgeon who had spent his life lecturing about the beauty of the human body, suddenly being asked to perform a complex operation with no idea how to hold a scalpel. "Well?" "Fix it," the younger instructor demanded, her voice shrill. She was looking at the old man, expecting him to have some magical, artistic solution. He fumbled inside, reaching a hand in hesitantly, then pulling it back quickly as if the broken string might bite him. It's broken," he stammered, his authority crumbling with every word. "The string, it has snapped. This is a catastrophic failure." He was using big words to hide the fact that he was completely, utterly useless. He looked at the tangled metal, then at the intricate hammers and levers, and it was all just a confusing, meaningless puzzle to him. The younger instructor pushed him aside, peering into the piano herself. "Of course it's broken, you fool. Can't you do something? Can't you, I don't know, tie it back together?" Her suggestion was ridiculous, a sign of her own desperation and ignorance. The old instructor's face turned a deep shade of red. He was the master, the expert. He was supposed to be in control. But now, in front of his wealthy clients and his star pupil, he was just a confused old man. He poked at a nearby key with a trembling finger. The hammer struck the broken string, producing only a dull, pathetic thud. He tried another. The same dead sound. The piano was silent, its voice gone. A murmur went through the small crowd of parents. They were not looking at the boy with pity anymore. They were looking at the two instructors with a new, questioning expression. The spell was broken. The illusion of their total mastery had been shattered by a single broken wire. The boy sat on the bench, his humiliation slowly being replaced by a dawning, confused sense of the situation. He hadn't broken it. It had just broken. And the people who were supposed to know everything about it didn't know what to do at all. In the heavy, awkward silence, a quiet sound was heard. It was the soft click of a latches being closed on a tool bag. Every head in the room, as if pulled by an invisible string, slowly turned towards the corner of the showroom. The older woman, the technician, had finished her work on the other piano. She was standing now, wiping her hands on a clean rag. She had been watching the entire scene unfold, her expression unchanged. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't confused. She was just observing, her calm blue eyes taking in the broken string, the flustered instructors, and the terrified boy on the bench. She looked like a doctor who had just seen a patient come into the emergency room with a fairly common and very fixable injury. And in that moment, she was the only person in the room who wasn't lost. The silence in the showroom was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The boy sat frozen on the bench, his eyes fixed on the coiled, broken string inside the piano. It looked like a metal vein that had burst, and the beautiful instrument was now bleeding out its voice. The old instructor and his protégé stood beside it, their faces pale and helpless. They were like two kings who had suddenly discovered their kingdom was made of cardboard and was dissolving in the rain. The small crowd of parents watched, their whispers silenced, their expressions a mixture of pity and judgment. It was in this moment of complete paralysis that a sound broke the tension. It was the soft, solid click of a metal latch being closed on a worn leather bag. Every head in the room turned, as if pulled by the same invisible string. The woman in the corner, the technician, was standing up. She slung the strap of her bag over her shoulder, then took a clean rag from her pocket and wiped her hands slowly, methodically. She wasn't looking at the people. Her calm blue eyes were fixed on the wounded piano in the center of the room. She began to walk. Her steps were not loud, but they were the only sound in the entire showroom. Her flat, practical shoes made a soft, steady rhythm on the polished wooden floor. Tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of purpose. As she moved, the crowd seemed to part for her without thinking. People took a small step back, creating a clear path from the corner to the center stage. It was as if they were acknowledging a different kind of authority. One that wasn't about performance or pretense, but about quiet competence. The old instructor saw her coming. A wave of emotions washed over his face, desperation, a flicker of hope, and then a stubborn, clinging pride. He straightened his back, trying to reclaim some of his former dignity. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. The woman didn't answer him directly. She stopped beside the piano and looked inside, her gaze scanning the damage. The younger instructor, who had been sullenly silent, now found her voice. "It's broken. Can't you see? It's completely ruined." She said it with a finality that hoped to dismiss the woman, to send her back to her corner. The technician ignored her. She leaned closer, peering into the complex maze of strings and hammers. "It's the A below middle C," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension like a sharp, clean knife. The tuning pin lost its hold. The string was fatigued. It was bound to happen sooner or later. Her simple, factual statement did two things at once. It perfectly diagnosed the problem with an authority the instructors lacked, and it subtly, gently, removed the blame from the boy's shoulders. The boy felt a tightness in his chest release. He hadn't broken it. It was just old and tired. The old instructor's face hardened. "Are you just going to stand there stating the obvious?" he barked. "Can you fix it or not?" The woman finally looked at him. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger. There was only a calm, Professional assessment. I can, she said simply. I'll need a new bass string. Do you have a replacement set for this model? The old instructor blinked. A replacement set? He had no idea. He looked at the younger instructor, who just shrugged, looking lost. He had never had to think about such things. That was for people like her? The shop. Of course they will have one, he stammered, his authority completely gone. Good, she said. I'll need it. And some space. Her tone was not a request. It was a statement of necessity. The two instructors, as if scalded, took a step back. The woman put her bag down on the floor and opened it again. This time, when she took out her tools, the room didn't see them as the implements of a simple mechanic. They watched as she laid them out on a small, clean cloth she placed on the piano's lid. There were wrenches of different sizes, long-nosed pliers, a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, and other strange metal objects whose purpose was a mystery to the onlookers. Each one was placed with a deliberate, careful precision. She reached into the piano with the pliers. Her hands, which had looked so plain and work-worn before, now seemed to transform. They moved with a grace and certainty that was mesmerizing to watch. Her fingers were strong but nimble. She carefully unhooked the broken string from the metal hitch pin at the bottom of the piano, then used the cutters to snip the string near the top. The sound of the metal cutters slicing through the thick wire was sharp and final. She coiled the broken piece neatly and set it aside. The entire room was holding its breath. The boy watched, completely captivated. He saw how she used a special tool to loosen the tuning pin, how she carefully threaded the new, shimmering string through the tiny hole in the pin, and how she guided it down over the bridge and through the hitch pin at the bottom. It was like watching a sailor tie a complex knot in a storm, every movement sure and practiced. There was no hesitation. Once the new string was in place, she began to tighten it. She used a long-handled tuning wrench, turning the pin slowly, carefully. The room was filled with a low, rising hum as the string's tension increased. She would turn a little, then stop and gently press the key. A dull thud would sound. She would listen, her head cocked to one side, then turn the pin a little more. Thud, a little higher. Thud. She was bringing the string back to life. Note by painful note, the old instructor and the younger instructor could only watch. They saw a world they knew nothing about, a world of physics and precision, of tension and vibration. They talked about the soul of the piano, but this woman was putting the bones and sinew back into it. She was the one who truly understood its body, finally. After what felt like an eternity, she gave the pin one last, tiny turn. She pressed the key. A single, clear, beautiful note rang out. It was the A below middle C. It wasn't just fixed. It was perfect. It had a richness and a resonance that seemed to make the air around it vibrate. But she wasn't done. She quickly played a few notes around it, then made tiny, almost invisible adjustments to the strings next to it. She was tuning not just the one string, but the whole section, making sure it all blended together perfectly. It was a level of care and professionalism that was completely foreign to the two T's, who were only concerned with the performance, not the preparation. When she was satisfied, she gently lowered the lid over the strings. She wiped her hands one last time on her rag, packed her tools away with the same methodical care she had laid them out, and then looked at the boy, who was still sitting on the bench. His eyes wide with awe and gratitude. She gave him a small, kind nod. "It's ready now," she said, her voice soft. Then she shouldered her bag, turned, and began to walk back towards the corner of the room, as if she had just done nothing more remarkable than changing a light bulb. The silence that followed her was not one of shock or shame, but one of profound, humbling respect. The technician's quiet words, "It's ready now," hung in the air like a gentle benediction. She gave the boy a small, kind nod, a gesture that seemed to carry more warmth and encouragement than anything the old instructor had ever said. Then she turned and walked away, her shoulders relaxed, her steps unhurried. She was heading back to her corner to collect the rest of her things, her job done. To her, it was just another broken string, just another piano brought back to life. But to everyone else in the room, the world had just tilted on its axis. The old instructor stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the perfect, gleaming piano, then at the woman's retreating back. His entire life he had built a wall between the artist and the technician. He had placed himself on a pedestal, looking down at those who worked with their hands. But in a few short minutes, this quiet woman had dismantled his entire worldview with a few simple tools and a lifetime of knowledge. He had been revealed as a fraud, a man who could talk about the soul of the instrument but had no idea how its body actually worked. The younger instructor looked equally stunned. Her face, usually a mask of confident superiority, was now pale and blank. She watched the technician walk away, and for the first time, she seemed to see her not as a mechanic, but as a master of a craft she couldn't even begin to comprehend. All her sharp words and clever insults had turned to ash. In her mouth, the boy on the bench was the only one who seemed to understand what had truly happened. He looked at the keys in front of him. They were no longer just ivory and wood. They were a gateway that had just been unlocked by a person who truly understood the gate. He felt a new kind of courage welling up inside him, a courage that had nothing to do with pleasing his teacher. It was a desire to do justice to the instrument, and to the quiet woman who had healed it without being told. Without a single word of command, the boy placed his fingers on the keys. He took a deep breath, but this time it wasn't a shaky, nervous breath. It was a calm, steady one. He began to play. The music that filled the showroom was not the same as before. It was not loud or aggressive. It was not a performance born of fear. It was something else entirely. It flowed from his fingers with a newfound grace and depth. The notes were clear and pure, and they seemed to hang in the air with a richness and resonance that the piano had never had before. The woman's tuning had not just fixed the broken string. It had brought the entire instrument to a state of perfect harmony. Every note was exactly where it should be, singing in perfect chorus with its neighbors. The boy played with a passion that was real, not forced. He was no longer thinking about the harsh words of his teacher or the judgmental eyes of the audience. He was thinking about the steady hands of the technician, the calm confidence in her voice, and the quiet dignity with which she had faced her mockers. He poured all of that into the music. It was a performance of gratitude, a story of respect, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever played. When the final note faded away, there was a moment of absolute, profound silence. The audience was spellbound. Even the old instructor and his protégés were captivated, their faces a mixture of awe and dawning horror. Then, the silence was broken by a single person clapping. It was an older man who had been standing quietly at the back of the room. He was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, and he had a presence that commanded attention. He had not been part of the master class. He had been waiting patiently for his own appointment. As he clapped, his hands meeting together with a firm, steady rhythm, the rest of the audience seemed to wake from a trance. They erupted into thunderous applause, a wave of sound that washed over the room, directed at the boy, but also at the piano itself. But the older man did not join the crowd in surrounding the boy. Instead, he began to walk, his path clear and direct. He walked past the beaming parents, past the humbled instructors, and straight towards the corner of the showroom where the technician was just about to zip up her bag. "Eleanor Vance," he said. His voice filled with a deep, genuine respect that was startling to hear. The woman stopped and looked up, a small, surprised smile on her face. "Mr. Davenport," she said. "I didn't see you there." The famous pianist, a man whose name was known in concert halls across the globe, smiled warmly. "I would not have missed it," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I have been hearing about your work for years, but to see it in person, it is like watching a master painter restore a forgotten masterpiece." He turned to the stunned crowd, his gesture including everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "you have had the privilege today of watching one of the world's great artists at work. This is not just a technician. This is the woman I trust with my own personal instrument. The only one. They call her the piano whisperer in Vienna, in London, in New York. She doesn't just tune pianos. She listens to them. She understands the wood, the felt, the metal. She knows what each instrument needs to sing its truest song. "And what you just heard," he said, gesturing towards the concert grand, "was that piano singing for the very first time." A collective gasp went through the room. The parents looked at the humble woman with new eyes, their expressions filled with awe. The boy on the bench watched, his heart swelling with a pride he felt on her behalf. But it was the two instructors who were truly broken. The old man's straight, rigid posture finally crumbled. He seemed to shrink, his silver hair suddenly looking less distinguished and more like a sign of his age. He looked at the woman, at the famous pianist, and then at his own trembling hands. He saw, for the first time, the vast, arrogant emptiness of his own pride. The younger instructor stood as if she had been turned to stone. Her carefully constructed world of status and superficiality had just been obliterated by a few simple words of truth. She had mocked a legend, a master respected by the very artist she pretended to emulate. The shame on her face was so deep it was almost painful to witness. Eleanor Vance, for her part, simply looked uncomfortable with the praise. She gave a small, humble shrug. "It just needed a new string and a little listening," she said softly. Mr. Davenport chuckled. "And that, my dear Eleanor, is what all great art is." He then turned his full attention to the boy. "And you, young man," he said, his voice kind, "you played with a new heart today. You honored her work." The woman shouldered her bag, gave the boy one last, warm smile, and walked towards the door. The crowd parted for her again, but this time it was not out of confusion, but out of reverence. She exited the showroom as quietly as she had entered, leaving behind a room full of people who had been given a lesson they would never forget. The two arrogant teachers were left standing in the center of the floor, in the deafening, well-deserved silence that followed. They were surrounded by the beautiful, expensive pianos they claimed to understand, but they had never felt more small or more alone. The boy, however, looked at the instrument in front of him, and for the first time, he didn't just see a piano. He saw a story of quiet skill, of humble mastery, and of the true music that lives not in arrogance, but in respect.